At Home in North Branch by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 4. Changes at the Shingle Mill. At Thomas's insistence, Sarah Jane went back home with her mother for the first 2 weeks of August. "I'm not an invalid," she said to me, "but it will be nice to spend some time with Ma. Thomas will come down on the weekends, and I'll be back in time to help you can fruit." We were standing in front of the house waiting for Thomas to bring the buggy around. She gave me a quick hug. "Thanks, Mabel, for being there. I couldn't have made it without you." "I didn't do anything but pray and cry with you," I said. "I've never felt so helpless." "When you don't know what to say, you don't say it," she replied. "When I don't know what to say, I make up something funny. In a crisis, I'd rather have you than me." Augusta had offered to help me make new curtains, so I took her along when I went to pick out the material. "Things certainly have changed here in the 3 years since you came," Augusta remarked as we neared the store. "The distance to town gets shorter every year. In '91, there was a post office, the livery stable, Gage's store, and one saloon. Now we have all these new businesses and people I hardly recognize, all because Jerome Grayson built a lumber mill." "And all because you sold him the land," I reminded her. "He would have had to develop either east or west of us on the river if you hadn't let him have that property." "It was the right decision," Augusta agreed. "I knew it meant changes. Do you know I was past 60 before I began to neighbor with folks I hadn't known all my life?" Jake Turner, the proprietor of the town's latest saloon, drove by on the road and tipped his hat. Augusta bowed slightly, then remarked, "On the other hand, I'm thankful for 60 years without some of 'em." I tied Regal in front of Gage's store, and we went to look at fabrics. Joel Gage, who worked for his father during the summer, came to meet us. "Morning, Miss Harris, Mrs. Williams. Can I help you with something?" "I think you can, Joel. I want to buy some of your yard goods." "I'll let Ma take care of that," he said with a grin. "I'm better at beans and sugar." Dorcas Gage showed us material, and I had just about decided on a dotted Swiss when a voice spoke behind us. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams and Miss Harris. It's a pleasure to see you again." Roland Brewer smiled engagingly. "My children are looking forward to the opening of school, and I must say that I'm pleased at the prospect also. My wife and I were worried that a country school might not offer an adequate education, but after meeting you, our minds are at ease." "Thank you, Mr. Brewer. I'm looking forward to having Daisy and Johnny this year." Augusta waited till Roland had left before she spoke. "Since I heard that he hired Cy Lawton at the mill, I've had some doubts about his good sense. I wouldn't hire Cy to burn my trash." "Mr. Brewer hasn't been around long enough to hear about the Lawtons," I said. "He'll learn." "Should have made it his business to find out. No good will come of it, mark my words." Cy and Agnes Lawton were comparative newcomers to North Branch, though they had lived in the community nearly 20 years. Cy was a ne'er-do-well and troublemaker who had been particularly intent upon making my first year of teaching a difficult experience. In addition to his only son, Abe, Cy had sent 4 daughters to school. There were 2 more at home waiting their turn. Elizabeth, the eldest Lawton daughter, was the same age as Len. Until I appeared on the scene, she had assumed that he would ask her to marry him. Needless to say, she had done nothing to make my life brighter. I pretty much ignored her presence in the community. Augusta's dark predictions didn't begin to cover the situation, I found out later. Jerome and Myra Grayson had come to spend the evening, and the conversation turned to the shingle mill. "Brewer is doing very well indeed," Jerome reported. "He has added 5 new hands in the mill and a lady in the office, Elizabeth Lawton." My mouth dropped open, and visions of the mill closing its doors before Sarah Jane's house could be finished flashed before me. "Just because they made your life miserable doesn't mean that they can't do a good job at the mill," I chided myself. Maybe this would improve conditions for Agnes Lawton. I had pitied Agnes from the moment I first saw her. Raising 7 children with Cy had made an old woman of her. The only time I had ever known her to stand up to Cy had been in my defense, and I was grateful to her for that. Sarah Jane returned. As she had promised, we worked together to put up fruit.
"Time goes faster when there's someone to work with,"
she noted.
"Just fruit and a paring knife aren't much company. There, that's the last of the peaches."
She washed off the knife and dried her hands.
"Thomas and I decided that it would be best for me to have something to occupy my time this fall. Would you like to ride over to Edenville with me in the morning to see about the school? We heard that it hasn't been taken yet."
"I'd love to," I said. "I was wondering how you'd feel to have September come and not be going to school."
"It's pretty hard to break a 17-year habit,"
Sarah Jane agreed.
"Even though teaching wasn't my first choice for this winter, it's a bearable alternative."
The weather was fine as we set out the next morning. We waved to Becky Handy, who was sweeping the porch of her boarding house. "I wonder why Lorenzo isn't doing that," I remarked. "He usually does the odd jobs around the place."
"Didn't Len tell you?"
Sarah Jane asked.
"Mr. Brewer hired Lorenzo to clean and sweep at the mill. He won't make a fortune, but I'm sure Becky is grateful for the little extra coming in."
"That restores my faith in the fellow's good judgment," I said.
"Lorenzo's?"
"No, silly, Roland Brewer's."
"Oh, you think he made a mistake when he took on your old friend, Elizabeth Lawton?"
"Maybe not," I shrugged. "It's possible she has talents that I've overlooked, but I'm glad for Lorenzo." As we passed the bank, the object of our conversation appeared. Roland Brewer holding the door open for Elizabeth Lawton.
"It certainly doesn't take long to develop a small-town mentality, does it?"
Sarah Jane sighed as we left town. "And what might that be?"
"Everybody's business is everybody's business," she replied. "We're both wondering if Elizabeth is up to her old tricks with the town's newest gentleman. How do we know they weren't together on business?"
"Well, you're right about the small town. If Elizabeth has anything other than business on her mind, someone will find out and let us know." The Edenville School Board president was delighted to have Sarah Jane return, and she signed the contract at once.
"Now that I've decided to go back, I'm anxious for school to start,"
she said as we headed toward town.
"I'll have plenty to occupy my mind as well as my time. How many children will you have this year?"
"I've lost 3 and I'll get 5, I replied. "So unless there are new arrivals, it will be 17. There's another Lawton this year, plus the little Stacy girl and the Brewer boy in the beginner class. Then Daisy Brewer in the 5th and Jay Stacy in the 7th with Joel."
"The Lawtons we will always have with us, huh?"
Sarah Jane grinned. "It seems that way. There's only one more to come, and by that time, I hope to be busy at something else." It was dinner time when we arrived home, and Mrs. Williams suggested that Len and I stay and eat with them. I was pleased to accept the invitation. "I really had an ulterior motive in asking you," she admitted as we ate. "The last of the berries are ready to pick, and I thought maybe you two would be interested in going with me." "I'd love to," I said happily. "Nothing tastes better than big red raspberries hot from the sun."
"I think what she had in mind was picking some to bring home," Sarah Jane put in. "You know, for pies and canning and such."
"Oh, that too, of course. But you know I can't pick anything without sampling it. If 3 of us are going, we should have enough left for at least 1 pie." The late August afternoon was hazy as we set out for the berry patch. The distant roar of the sawmill reminded us of the changes that had been taking place in North Branch over the last 2 years. Passenger and freight trains stopped several times a day. Lumber and shingles were shipped out, and logs were brought into the mill by rail and by river. New houses were going up and businesses were opening along Main Street. We even had our own newspaper, published weekly and costing $1 a year. As we picked the ripe fruit, I could hear the voices of children calling to each other. Only a few days of freedom left for them. My thoughts wandered to plans for opening school. Then, suddenly, I was aware of a voice coming from a tangle of berry bushes nearby. It was Daniel Grayson.
"You'd better not if you know what's good for you,"
he was saying. And what are you going to do about it? A taunting voice replied. What if I tell my papa? Now, who is that? I wondered. And what are they fussing about? A moment later, a blonde head came into view, and I recognized Daisy Brewer. Whatever their disagreement had been, she was evidently going to walk away from it. She stalked off toward home, followed by her younger brother. Len and I enjoyed raspberries with cream for supper. Although he carried on a conversation about everyday affairs, I could see that he was disturbed about something. The problem came out as we sat on the porch later in the evening. I met Gladys Burton in town today. I pictured Gladys in my mind, an older lady in the church who usually had a complaint about some person or situation. I smiled to myself, recalling Augusta's description of her. Poor Gladys. She always looks as though she smelled something bad. What is she unhappy about? I asked Len. Anything you can take care of? Not very easily. She's upset that Elizabeth has been hired to work for Roland Brewer. She thinks I should visit the man and tell him to beware of the Lawtons. And you declined? I told her I didn't think it was any of my business, and she became quite belligerent. In fact, she gave me a choice. Len sighed. I've never been happy about that Lawton bunch being a part of our church, she said. They're a disgrace to the community, and it's your duty to rid the membership of such as her. If you don't, you won't be seeing me in your congregation. Oh, Len, what did you tell her? I said we'd miss her. Good for you. I'm glad you stood up to her. Goodness knows Elizabeth and I have had our differences, but putting her out of the church isn't going to solve them. I don't want to lose Gladys Burton either, Len said. I'm sure Jesus had difficult people to deal with in his ministry. I wish I had his wisdom to work with the ones we have. At the risk of sounding like Sarah Jane, I could quote some scripture to you, I offered. I know, he grinned. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. I'll do just that. I wonder why we try to solve our own problems when we can have help for the asking. Later, my mind went back to the problems of the Lawtons. I had to admit that my attitude toward them was no more Christian than was Gladys Burton's. I never tried to befriend Elizabeth or show her love. If the Lawtons came to mind at all, it was with a feeling of distrust and dislike. Even Sarah Jane had once chided me. For someone who has as much good sense as you usually have, you do have a blind spot when it comes to that Lawton bunch. You would too if they had dealt you as much sorrow as they've given me. They were plotting against me before they even knew my name. What are you going to do to get even? She asked. Get even? You know I wouldn't do that. You might as well, she replied with a shrug. You're hurting yourself more than you are them by letting it gnaw at you. I knew she was right. So what do you suggest that I do about it? I said. Have I ever told you what to do about your personal affairs? She grinned. Only about 1,000 times. Nevertheless, I knew in my heart that I would have to resolve the problem. I asked the Lord to help me forgive the past and to stop regarding the Lawtons with distrust. August ended, and I was ready for school to open on the day after Labor Day. It appeared that all my students were not as anxious to return. Daniel says he has considered not attending school this year, Myra Grayson informed me. His father convinced him that the subject wasn't up for consideration, but he's not happy. Have you any idea why? I asked. No, he only says he'll miss Serena. I don't think that's all there is to it, but I don't know what else it could be. He's always liked school, especially since we've been here. I thought about Daniel with the booming voice and happy grin and agreed that this turn of events was odd. I would keep a watchful eye for the cause of his unhappiness. Children sometimes showed more than they told. End of chapter 4.